From the newsrooms of London to the halls of power in Washington, there is a persistent and often dangerous tendency to view conflicts in the Middle East through a very particular lens. It is a lens that seeks clear narratives, distinct heroes and villains, and above all, a definitive conclusion. Wars are expected to have a beginning, a middle, and a final victorious end, much like a Hollywood film. This perspective demands a clear winner and a clear loser, after which peace is supposed to descend and stability is meant to take root. We have seen this time and again, where military action is presented as a surgical tool that can excise a problem, allowing for a neat and tidy resolution before the world's attention moves on to the next crisis. This is a deeply ingrained way of thinking, but it fundamentally misunderstands the very fabric of the region. This desire for straightforward stories often leads to what can only be described as triumphalism. When a military objective is achieved, a leader toppled, a territory seized, an enemy force scattered, there is a rush to declare mission accomplished. Political leaders stand before flags and cameras, announcing a new dawn and the end of a dark chapter. Yet, this triumphalism is almost always premature. It is a declaration made for an external audience, one that is hungry for good news and simple resolutions. It fails to account for the intricate web of relationships, historical grievances, and cultural memories that define life and conflict in the Middle East. The people who live there, whose families have inhabited these lands for generations, do not see events in such black and white terms. For them, history is not a closed book, but a living, breathing presence that shapes their every interaction and perception. The reality on the ground is far more complex and far less cinematic. What looks like a victory from thousands of miles away often feels like just another turn of a painful, seemingly endless wheel to those who must live with the consequences. A military campaign might end, but the underlying tensions that fueled it rarely disappear. In fact, they often metastasize, finding new and more virulent forms of expression. The Western expectation of a clean slate, of a society ready to be rebuilt from scratch according to an external blueprint, ignores the deep roots of identity, religion, and tribe. It fails to appreciate that every action, especially a violent one, sends ripples across generations, creating new martyrs, new grievances, and new motivations for future conflict. The end of one battle is often just the prelude to the next. Therefore, the fundamental disconnect is one of perspective. The West often sees war as an instrument of policy, a tool to be used to achieve a specific, measurable outcome. Once that outcome is reached, the tool is put away, and the job is considered done. But for the peoples of the Middle East, war is not a distant policy decision. It is a catastrophic interruption of life that redefines society for decades to come. It is an event that is absorbed into the collective memory, told and retold in stories passed from parents to children. It is a source of trauma and a catalyst for change, but rarely is it an ending. Understanding this difference in perception is the very first step toward comprehending why the dream of a quick, final victory in the Middle East remains just that, a dream. History provides a powerful and sobering corrective to the notion of easy victories in the Middle East. The region's past is littered with the ghosts of triumphs that were merely fleeting moments of advantage. These were not endpoints but turning points, sowing the seeds of future conflicts. Consider the very state of Israel, born from a victory in 1948. For its founders, it was a triumphant return. But for Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe. That single event has fueled a cycle of violence, war, and uprising that continues to this very day. One side's victory became the other's foundational grievance, ensuring peace would remain elusive for generations. This pattern is not unique to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a recurring theme across the region's modern history. Every decisive military win creates a vacuum or new resentments that another power rushes to fill. Defeating an enemy can empower a different, more dangerous foe. Regional powers consistently use proxies to fight their battles. A victory for one proxy is seen as humiliating defeat for the sponsoring nation, prompting renewed commitment to evening the score. The battlefield simply shifts, from the mountains of Lebanon to the deserts of Syria or the streets of Baghdad. The conflict doesn't end, it merely changes its address. Take the long and brutal Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. After 8 years of horrific bloodshed, the war ended in stalemate. Both sides claimed victory for domestic political purposes, but no genuine peace was achieved. The war left both nations scarred and paranoid. Iraq soon turned its attention to Kuwait, leading to the Gulf War. Iran doubled down on asymmetric warfare and support for Shia militias, shaping Middle East geopolitics today. The supposed end was simply a pause before the next phase began. The illusion of triumph stems from failure to see conflict as a system, not a simple duel between opponents, but a complex ecosystem of state actors, non-state groups, ethnic loyalties, and religious ideologies. A decisive blow sends shockwaves throughout, causing unforeseen realignments. Victory might remove a leader or dismantle an organization, but doesn't erase the conditions that created them. Another group rises to take its place. This cycle ensures celebration of victory is almost always short-lived, replaced by the realization that the problem has merely transformed. The historical record is replete with stark examples of how apparent victories have unraveled. One of the most telling is the event known as Black September in Jordan in 1970. King Hussein, feeling his authority threatened by the growing power of the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, launched a decisive military campaign to crush them. From a purely tactical standpoint, he won. The PLO was expelled from Jordan, but this victory had devastating long-term consequences. The defeated and radicalized PLO fighters moved to Lebanon, fundamentally destabilizing that fragile, multi-confessional state and setting the stage for its 15-year civil war. The Black September organization, a more extreme faction, was born from this defeat, carrying out terrorist attacks, most famously at the 1972 Munich Olympics. Jordan's victory did not end the Palestinian problem. It exported and radicalized it. Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon is another powerful case study. The stated goal was to destroy the PLO's military infrastructure and secure Israel's northern border. Militarily, the operation was a stunning success in its initial phases. The Israeli Defense Forces advanced all the way to Beirut, and the PLO leadership was once again forced into exile, this time to Tunisia. It seemed like a comprehensive victory. Yet, the outcome was catastrophic. The power vacuum created by the PLO's departure was filled by a new and far more formidable enemy, Hezbollah. Nurtured by Iran's Revolutionary Guards, this Shia militia grew from a small resistance movement into a powerful political and military force that would become Israel's most persistent and capable adversary. The 1982 war, meant to bring peace to the Galilee, instead created a permanent, low-intensity war zone in southern Lebanon for nearly 2 decades and gave birth to an enemy that remains a major threat today. More recently, the American experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq offer sobering lessons on an even grander scale. The 2001 invasion of Afghanistan swiftly toppled the Taliban regime in a matter of weeks. The triumphalist narrative was that a brutal theocracy had been defeated and a new democracy would rise in its place. 20 years, trillions of dollars, and countless lives later, the Taliban returned to power the moment American forces withdrew. The initial victory was a mirage that masked a deep misunderstanding of Afghan society and the resilience of the insurgency. Similarly, the 2003 invasion of Iraq removed the dictator Saddam Hussein in a spectacular show of shock and awe. This was hailed as a great liberation, but the subsequent collapse of the state, the disbanding of the Iraqi army, and the de-Baathification policies created a fertile ground for a sectarian civil war and the rise of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which would later morph into the even more terrifying entity known as ISIS. Even the Arab Spring of 2011, initially celebrated in the West as a triumphant, spontaneous blossoming of democracy, demonstrates this pattern. The toppling of dictators in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya was seen as an unambiguous victory for the people. But what followed was not a smooth transition to liberal democracy. In Egypt, it led to a brief, polarizing rule by the Muslim Brotherhood, followed by an even more autocratic military government. In Libya, the fall of Gaddafi, facilitated by NATO air power, resulted in a failed state, a decade of civil war, and a haven for militants and human traffickers. In Syria, the uprising descended into the most brutal and complex conflict of the 21st century. The initial moment of triumph was fleeting, quickly overwhelmed by the deep-seated problems that the revolutions had unleashed. Each of these cases tells the same story. A clear-cut victory is often the beginning of a new, more complicated chapter of conflict. Every significant military victory in the Middle East seems to carry within it the seeds of its own undoing, a phenomenon that makes these triumphs profoundly Pyrrhic. A Pyrrhic victory is one achieved at such a devastating cost that it is indistinguishable from defeat. In the context of the Middle East, this cost is not just measured in lives and treasure, but in the political and social blowback that follows. When a state or an army achieves its military objectives, it often does so through methods that alienate the very population it needs to win over for long-term stability. The destruction of homes, the loss of civilian life, and the humiliation of a defeated populace do not create a foundation for peace. Instead, they create a deep well of resentment from which new fighters and new forms of resistance will inevitably draw their strength for years to come. Consider the strategic logic. A conventional army, like that of Israel or the United States, is designed to defeat other conventional armies. It excels at destroying targets and seizing territory. But the conflicts in the Middle East are rarely conventional. They are wars fought amongst the people, where the center of gravity is not an enemy army, but popular opinion and legitimacy. So, when an F-16 bombs a building suspected of housing militants but also kills innocent family members inside, a tactical success has been achieved, but a major strategic failure has occurred. That single act creates a family, a clan, and a village that now has a blood feud with the victor. The military has won the battle, but in doing so, it has lost the war for hearts and minds, ensuring the insurgency will continue, fueled by a desire for revenge. This dynamic is precisely what has fueled the longevity of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Israel possesses overwhelming military superiority and has repeatedly launched major operations in Gaza and Lebanon. It has degraded the capabilities of these groups, destroyed their infrastructure, and killed many of their leaders. By any traditional military metric, these operations could be framed as successes. Yet after each conflict, the political standing of these groups among their constituents often rises. They are seen as defiant defenders of their people against a powerful aggressor. The destruction wrought by Israeli forces serves as their most potent recruitment tool. The military victory, therefore, inadvertently strengthens the political and ideological position of the very enemy it was meant to weaken, guaranteeing a future confrontation. Furthermore, the very act of winning a war can transform the victor for the worse. The long-term occupation of territory and the need to police a hostile population can have a corrosive effect on the morale, ethics, and democratic values of the occupying power. The daily grind of checkpoints, raids, and counterinsurgency measures can brutalize the young soldiers tasked with carrying them out and polarize the society that sent them. Israel's decades-long occupation of the West Bank and the United States' long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have sparked intense and painful debates within their own societies. The triumphalism of the initial victory gives way to a weary, divisive, and morally ambiguous struggle, proving that the costs of such successes are paid not only by the vanquished, but also by the victor. To understand the conflicts of the Middle East, one must look beyond troop movements and political treaties. One must listen to the stories that are told around dinner tables and in cafes, from Beirut to Tehran. These are stories of past injustices, of lost lands, of martyred heroes, and of perceived betrayals. History in this part of the world is not a sterile academic subject. It is a living, breathing force that shapes identity and fuels emotion. Grievances are not forgotten after a generation. They are nurtured, embellished, and passed down as a sacred inheritance. The memory of the Crusades, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Sykes-Picot Agreement that carved up the region, and the creation of Israel are not distant historical events. They are felt as present-day realities that explain the current state of affairs and justify ongoing struggle. This deep sense of historical memory means that conflicts are rarely seen as isolated incidents. Instead, each new battle is viewed as the latest chapter in a long, continuous story of struggle. For many in the Arab and Persian worlds, Western intervention today is seen through the prism of colonial domination from a century ago. A political cartoon in a Cairo newspaper might depict a modern leader as a new crusader, drawing a direct line across 1,000 years of history. For many Israelis, the existential threats they face are seen through the prism of the Holocaust and centuries of persecution, making compromise on security seem like a suicidal risk. These powerful historical narratives create an emotional context that makes rational, realpolitik solutions incredibly difficult to achieve. Every proposal is weighed against the baggage of the past. Iran's national psyche, for example, is deeply informed by its long and proud history as a major civilization, but also by more recent memories of foreign interference. The 1953 CIA-backed coup that overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh is a cornerstone of modern Iranian identity. It is seen as the ultimate proof of Western perfidy and is used to justify the Islamic Republic's deep suspicion of the United States. When Iranian leaders speak of the Great Satan, they are not just using empty rhetoric. They are tapping into a powerful folk memory of humiliation and betrayal. This makes any attempt at rapprochement fraught with difficulty, as the ghosts of the past are always present at the negotiating table, whispering warnings of caution and mistrust. This emotional landscape, saturated with memory and grievance, is why triumphalism is so dangerous. A victory declared by one side is never accepted as a final verdict by the other. Instead, it is recorded as another injustice in the long ledger of historical wrongs that must one day be righted. It becomes another story of loss and resilience to be told to the next generation, another reason to resist, another justification for future sacrifice. Peace treaties can be signed by leaders, but unless they address these deep-seated emotional wounds, they remain just pieces of paper. True reconciliation requires a reckoning with history, an acknowledgement of the other's pain. Without that, the echoes of the past will continue to drown out the calls for a different future, ensuring the cycle of conflict continues. There is a concept in Greek mythology about the Hydra, a serpentine water monster with many heads. For every head that a hero would cut off, 2 more would grow in its place. This ancient myth serves as a remarkably apt metaphor for the dynamics of conflict in the modern Middle East. Time and again, a military campaign successfully eliminates a specific threat, a dictator, a terrorist leader, or an organization, only for new, often more dangerous threats to emerge from the resulting chaos. The declaration of victory over one enemy frequently marks the unintentional creation of the next. This is not a failure of military capability, but a failure to understand the complex social and political ecosystem in which these conflicts take place. The U.S. experience in Iraq is the quintessential example of the Hydra effect. The primary goal of the 2003 invasion was to remove Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime. This was accomplished with stunning speed. Yet, the decapitation of the Iraqi state and the subsequent decision to disband its army created a massive power vacuum and left hundreds of thousands of trained, armed, and unemployed Sunni men feeling disenfranchised. These men became the backbone of a fierce insurgency. A key leader of this insurgency was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, whose group, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was far more radical and sectarian than Saddam's secular regime ever was. The victory over Saddam directly led to the rise of a far more ideologically driven and vicious enemy. The story did not end there. After years of brutal counterinsurgency warfare, U.S. and Iraqi forces managed to defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq, killing Zarqawi and many of his followers. By the time U.S. forces withdrew in 2011, the threat seemed contained. Another victory was declared, but from the ashes of that defeated organization, something even more monstrous grew. The remnants of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, hardened by years of war and exploiting the chaos of the Syrian civil war next door, rebranded and reconstituted themselves. They became the Islamic State, or ISIS. This new Hydra head was not just a terrorist group, it was a proto-state that seized vast territories in both Iraq and Syria, committing genocide and broadcasting its brutality to the world. The effort to cut off one head had spawned a global threat. This pattern is driven by a simple reality: destroying something is much easier than building something to replace it. Military force is very effective at destruction, but it is a crude and often counterproductive tool for state building. When an authoritarian regime is toppled, so too is the entire structure of control, patronage, and social order that it, for better or worse, provided. Unless a legitimate and capable new structure can be established almost immediately, a near impossible task, chaos will reign. It is in this chaos that extremism flourishes. Radical groups offer a sense of purpose, order, and identity to those who have lost everything. Thus, the triumphant moment of a statue falling is often the prelude to the rise of a black flag. In the end, the greatest lesson that the tumultuous history of the Middle East teaches us is the folly of seeking simple, linear narratives. This is not a region where history moves in a straight line, from problem to solution, from war to peace. It is, instead, an endlessly complex tapestry, woven from threads of faith, ethnicity, memory, and power. pulling on a single thread in one corner, declaring a victory, toppling a regime, backing a faction, inevitably distorts the pattern across the entire fabric in ways that are impossible to predict. The belief that one can impose a final, tidy ending onto this story is a profound and dangerous delusion. The reality is that history in this region does not conclude. It recycles, rhymes, and perpetually unfolds. The pursuit of triumphalism is therefore not just naive, it is actively harmful. It creates unrealistic expectations that, when inevitably unmet, lead to frustration, disillusionment, and a desire to disengage completely. Or worse, it leads to a doubling down on the very military strategies that created the unintended consequences in the first place. A more sober and sustainable approach requires a fundamental shift in mindset. It requires replacing the desire for quick victories with a commitment to patient, long-term management of intractable problems. It means understanding that real positive change is incremental, painstakingly slow, and often comes from within the societies themselves, not from external force. This means acknowledging that there are no easy answers to the questions posed by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Iran's regional ambitions, or the future of post-war Syria and Iraq. These are not puzzles to be solved, but conditions to be managed. Diplomacy, economic development, cultural engagement, and the patient nurturing of civil society are less dramatic than military campaigns, but they are the only tools that offer any hope of gradually changing the underlying conditions that fuel conflict. This approach is less satisfying for cable news headlines and political speeches, but it is one that respects the depth and complexity of the region and its people. It is an approach rooted in humility rather than hubris. Ultimately, anyone seeking to understand the Middle East must learn to read its history not as a series of finished chapters, but as a continuous, unfolding narrative. The conflicts of today are inseparable from the events of 1916, 1948, 1979, and 2003. Future stability will depend not on who wins the next battle, but on whether the combatants and the outside powers that influence them can finally learn to escape the gravitational pull of their own pasts. The dream of a final victory is a siren song that has lured generations into a cycle of violence. The only path forward is to turn away from that song and embrace the messy, complicated, and unending work of managing coexistence in a region where history is always and forever present.